Hello, and welcome to The Essential Reads. My name is Isaac, and my goal is to bring to you a bunch of classic audiobooks in an easy and accessible way. It is a Friday, so we are continuing with a short story, Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. And next time I do a short story and I do a poll about it, guys, let me know how long the bloody short story is. It's 3 parts, but each bit is like 40 minutes long. These take so long to edit. These take like a full 2 days for me to do with the soundscaping and everything. Guys, I have bills to pay. I can't do this unless you guys watch the videos. I also have to pay for drama school. Oh dear. Loving the book though, but let's continue and we'll finish up on the final chapter and figure out how much Franz Kafka hates himself and his parents if he were a bug. Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. 3. The serious injury Gregor had sustained, from which he suffered for more than a month because no one dared to remove it, the apple stuck in his back as a visible reminder, seemed to have made his father realize that Gregor, in spite of his present sorry and repulsive shape, was a member of the family, who should not be treated with hostility, and that family duty obliged them to swallow their revulsion and tolerate him, but no more than that. Although Gregor's wound meant that he had lost his mobility, probably forever, and that, for the time being, he took many long minutes, like an ancient invalid, to cross the room, crawling up the walls was out of the question. Yet this worsening of his condition was compensated, in his view quite adequately, by the fact that towards evening, the door to the living room, which he took to watching closely an hour or two beforehand, was opened, so that from where he lay in the darkness of his room, he could, without being seen, observe the whole family round the well-lit table and listen to their conversation, as it were, with their general approval. A quite different situation from before. To be sure, these were no longer lively exchanges of earlier times, such as Gregor had always recalled with a certain longing when he had thrown himself wearily between the damp bedclothes in the tiny room of some hotel. Things were mostly very quiet now. His father went to sleep in the chair soon after supper. His mother and sister urged each other to silence. Bending down low under the light, his mother sewed fine linen for a fashion shop. His sister, who had taken a job as a shop assistant, was learning shorthand and French in the evening in hope that she might get a better job later on. Sometimes his father would wake up and, as if unaware that he had been asleep, say to his wife, "What a long time you spent sewing again today." Ugh. And drop off to sleep again at once, while mother and sister smiled wearily at each other. With a certain stubbornness, his father also refused to take off his messenger uniform at home, and while his dressing gown hung unused on a hook, would doze fully dressed in his chair, as if always ready for duty and waiting even here for his boss's voice. As a result, his uniform, which had not even been new at the start, became soiled in spite of the care his mother and sister took with it, and Gregor often spent whole evenings gazing at this heavily stained coat, with its gold buttons kept shiny by constant polishing, in which the old man slept so very uncomfortably, and yet peacefully. As soon as the clock struck 10, Gregor's mother would try to wake his father in a quiet voice, and then persuade him to go to bed, because he couldn't sleep properly here, and he needed his sleep because he had to start work at 6.
Let's go, come on.
But with the obstinacy that he had developed since he became a messenger, he'd always insisted on staying at the table even longer, although he fell asleep regularly, and could then, only with great difficulty, be persuaded to leave his armchair and go to bed. However much his wife and daughter tried to induce him with gentle hints, he would slowly shake his head for a quarter of an hour, keep his eyes shut, and stay put.
It's going to be okay.
His wife would tug at his sleeve and whisper encouragingly into his ear. His daughter would leave her work to help her mother, but nothing could move him. He only sank deeper into his chair. Only when the 2 women seized him under the arms would he open his eyes and look at them in turn and say, "What a life! So this is the peace and quiet of my old age." And supported by the 2 women, he would struggle to his feet, as if it were a great burden to himself. Let the women lead him to the door, where he would wave them away and continue on his own, while his wife would quickly drop her sewing, and his daughter her pen, in order to run after him and help him along. Who in this exhausted and overtaxed family had time to look after Gregor any more than was absolutely necessary? The household was reduced even further. Now the maid was finally dismissed, and a huge, bony cleaner with tousled white hair came in mornings and evenings to do the heaviest work. Gregor's mother looked after everything else, along with all her sewing. Even various pieces of family jewellery, which his mother and sister had previously worn with great delight at social occasions and celebrations, was sold, as Gregor learned, when they discussed among themselves the prices they had fetched.
It's going to be able to keep us going for a little
But what they
bit
complained
longer.
about most was that they could not leave this apartment, which was far too large for their present circumstances, because they could not think of how they were to move Gregor. But Gregor realized that it was not only consideration for him that stood in the way of a move, for he could easily have been transported in a suitable box with a few holes for air. The main thing holding the family back from moving to another apartment was more their complete hopelessness, and the thought that they had suffered a misfortune such as no one else had in the whole circle of their family and acquaintances. To the very limits of their abilities, they did what the world demands of impoverished people. His father fetched breakfast for minor bank officials. His mother devoted herself to washing other people's linen. His sister rushed to and fro behind the counter at customers' biddings. But that was as far as the family's energies stretched. And Gregor would feel the pain from the wound in his back all over again when his mother and sister returned after putting his father to bed, put aside their work, and huddled together cheek to cheek. And when his mother then pointed to his room, saying, "Shut that door, Greta." And he was left there in the darkness, while next door the women wept together, or simply stared at the table, dry-eyed. Gregor spent his nights and days almost entirely without sleeping. Sometimes he imagined that the next time the door opened, he would take over the family's affairs again, just as he had done before. In his thoughts, his boss and the chief clerk would reappear after a long absence, as well as the underclerks and the trainees, the slow-witted janitor, 2 or 3 friends from other firms, a chambermaid from a hotel in the country, a sweet and flitting memory, a cashier in a milliner's shop, whom he had courted in earnest, but not urgently enough. These all appeared, together with strangers or people he had forgotten. But instead of helping him and his family, they were all unapproachable, and he was glad when they had vanished. But then at other times, he was in no mood to worry about his family. He was only filled with rage at how badly they treated him. And though he could think of nothing he might wish to eat, he would plan of ways of getting into the larder and take out what he was still entitled to, even if he was not hungry. His sister now no longer gave any thought before giving Gregor something he might really enjoy. Before, she dashed off to work in the morning and after lunch. She hurriedly pushed some kind of food into his room with her foot, and then in the evening, unconcerned as to whether he had even tasted it, or, as was more usually the case, had not touched it at all, she would clear it out with a swish of her broom. As for cleaning his room, which she now always did in the evening, this could not have been done more hurriedly. Dirty streaks ran along the walls, and here and there lay humps of dust and filth. Initially, Gregor would position himself in some particularly dirty corner of the room when she arrived, by way of indicating his disapproval to her. But he could well have stayed there for weeks before she did anything about it. She saw the filth just as clearly as he did, and had made up her mind to leave it there. At the same time she saw to it, with a touchiness that was quite new in her, and which had indeed spread to the whole family, that tidying Gregor's room was entirely left to her. His mother had once given Gregor's room a thorough cleaning, which he had managed to do only after using several buckets of water. Moreover, the excessive dampness had set him, and he lay stretched out on the sofa, resentful and immobile. But his mother did not get away with it. As soon as she noticed the change in his room, his sister, deeply offended, rushed into the living room, and though her mother raised her hands imploringly, burst into a fit of tears at which her parents, her startled father, had of course jumped up from his armchair, at first looked on in helpless astonishment, until they too began to stir. His father upbraided his mother to his right for not leaving the cleaning of Gregor's room to his sister, while to his left he shouted at his sister that she would never again be allowed to clean the room, while his mother tried to drag his father, who was beside himself in his agitation, into the bedroom. His sister, shaken by sobs, hammered on the table with her little fists, while Gregor hissed out loud, furious that it occurred to none of them to shut the door and spare him from this spectacle and uproar. But even if his sister, exhausted from her work, had tired of looking after Gregor as she had before, there was still no need for his mother to do it instead, and there was no reason why he should be neglected, for they now had a cleaner. This old widow, whose powerful frame must have helped her to survive the worst that had happened to her during her long lifetime, was not, in fact, repelled by Gregor. Without being particularly curious, she had once happened to open the door to his room, and at the sight of him, had stood there astonished, her hands folded in front of her, as Gregor, taken completely by surprise, began to scurry to and fro, even though no one was after him. Since that occasion, she never failed to open the door a little for a short while every morning and evening, and look in on him. At first, she would even call him over to her with words, which were no doubt meant to be friendly, such as, "Come over here, you dirty old beetle," or, "Just look at that filthy old beetle." Gregor made no response to these approaches. He remained motionless where he was, as if the door had not been opened. If only this cleaner had been told to clean his room every day, instead of letting her disturb him for no reason whenever the mood took her. Once, early in the morning, a heavy shower, perhaps an early sign of approaching spring, was spattering the window panes. Gregor was so exasperated when the cleaner started on her usual patter that he turned on her, albeit slowly and feebly, as if to attack her. But instead of being afraid, she simply took a chair from near the door and lifted it above her head. Standing there with her mouth wide open, it was quite clear that she only intended to close it again when she had brought the chair crashing down on Gregor's back. "That's quite close enough now," she said as Gregor turned away, and calmly replaced the chair in the corner. Now Gregor was eating scarcely anything. Only if he happened to come upon the food that had been made for him would he try a mouthful just for something to do. Keep it there for hours, and then usually spit it out again. At first, he thought it was his depression at the state of his room that stopped him from eating. But in fact, he very soon came to terms with the changes to his room. The family had taken to putting things they could not keep anywhere else in his room, and now there were a lot of these things, because they had let one room of the apartment to 3 lodgers. These dignified gentlemen, all 3 wore full beards, as Gregor once observed through a crack in the door, were punctilious about tidiness. Not only in their room, but also, now that they were renting a room here, in their whole household, particularly the kitchen. They could not tolerate useless junk, especially if it was dirty. Besides, they had brought most of their own furniture with them, so a lot of things that could not be sold, but which the family did not want to throw out, had become superfluous. All these things found their way into Gregor's room, including the ash box and the rubbish bin from the kitchen. The cleaner, who was always in a great hurry, simply flung anything that was not immediately needed into his room. Fortunately, all Gregor usually saw was the object in question, and the hand that held it. The cleaner might have intended to take these things out again, when time or opportunity allowed, or to throw it all out at once. But as it was, they just lay there where they had been thrown, except when Gregor wriggled his way through the junk and shifted it about. At first, he was forced to do this because he had no space to crawl around, but later he did it with increasing pleasure, although after these exertions he felt tired to death and depressed, and would lie motionless for hours. Because the lodgers also occasionally took their evening meal in the family room, on many evenings the door to his room remained closed. But Gregor could quite easily do without having the door open. After all, on several evenings when the door was open, he had not taken advantage of it, but had kept in the darkest corner of his room without the family noticing. But on one occasion, the cleaner had left the door to the living room ajar, and it stayed like that even when the lodgers came in that evening and the lights were turned on. They seated themselves at the head of the table, where in earlier times, Gregor, his father, and his mother had sat, unfolded their serviettes, and picked up their knives and forks. At once, Gregor's mother appeared in the doorway with a dish of meat, followed closely by his sister with a bowl piled high with potatoes. Clouds of steam rose from the food. The lodgers bent over the dishes put in front of them, as if to test the food before they ate it. And the one sitting in the middle, to whom the others seemed to defer as being the authority, actually cut a piece of meat while it was still on the dish, obviously to establish whether it was tender enough, or whether it ought perhaps to be sent back to the kitchen. He was satisfied, and Gregor's mother and sister, who had been watching the suspense, sighed with relief and began to smile. The family itself ate in the kitchen. Even so, before he went into the kitchen, Gregor's father came into the living room, bowed once, and with his cap in his hand, walked round the table. The 3 lodgers rose and murmured something into their beards. Then, when they were alone, they ate in almost complete silence. Gregor found it strange that among all the various sounds of eating, he could always hear them chewing, as if to show him that teeth were needed in order to eat, and that even the finest jaws were no use without teeth. "I feel hungry too," said Gregor to himself sadly, "but not for these things. Look at those lodgers tucking in, and I'm starving." It was that same evening, Gregor could not remember having heard it all this time, that the sound of a violin came from the kitchen. The lodgers had finished their meal. The one in the middle had produced a newspaper and given each of the others a page, and they were leaning back in their chairs, reading and smoking. When the violin began to play, they listened attentively, got up and tiptoed to the door of the hallway and stood there huddled together. They must have been heard from the kitchen, for Gregor's father called, "Perhaps the gentlemen don't like the music. I can have it stopped at once." "On the contrary," said the middle one. "Would the young lady not like to come in here and play? It's much more convenient and comfortable here." "With pleasure," said the father's voice, as if he were the musician. The gentleman went back into the living room and waited. Soon Gregor's father came into the room with the music stand, his mother with the music, and his sister with the violin. His sister calmly arranged everything for playing. Her parents, who had never left the rooms before, and so behaved overly politely towards their lodgers, did not dare sit in their own chairs. The father leaned against the door, his right hand tucked between two of the buttons that fastened his uniform jacket. But his wife took the chair offered by one of the gentlemen, and because she had left the chair just where he had happened to place it, sat there in a far corner of the room. Gregor's sister started to play. Her father and mother on either side followed the movements of her hands attentively. Gregor, drawn by her playing, had ventured to move forward a little, and his head was already in the living room. He did not find it particularly strange that he had shown so little consideration for the others, though earlier he had taken pride in doing so. And yet just now he had all the more reason to hide away, for because of the dust that lay everywhere in his room and flew around at his slightest movement, he himself was also covered with dust. On his back and his flanks, he dragged around fluff, hairs, and leftover bits of food, and he cared far too little about anything to have rolled onto his back, as he had done previously several times a day to rub himself clean on the carpet. So, in spite of the state he was in, he was not afraid to crawl a little way into the spotless floor of the living room. Besides, no one took any notice of him. The family were wholly absorbed in the sound of the violin. The lodgers, however, who had been initially standing with their hands in their pockets far too close behind his sister's music stand so they could read all the lines of the notes, which must surely have disturbed her, soon withdrew to the window, bending their heads and conversing in low voices. And there they remained. Gregor's father watched them anxiously, and now it really seemed all too clear that they had been disappointed in their anticipation of hearing some beautiful or entertaining music on the violin, that they had had enough of the whole recital, and were only allowing their peace to be interrupted out of politeness. In particular, the way they blew cigar smoke up into the air out of their mouths and noses suggested their great irritation. And yet, Gregor's sister played so beautifully. She had held her head on one side, and her eyes followed the rows of notes intently and sadly. Gregor crawled a little further forward, and held his head close to the floor, trying to catch her glance. Was he a beast when he was so moved by music? It was as if he were being shown the way to the unknown nourishment he craved. He was determined to go right up to his sister and tug at her dress to persuade her to bring her violin into his room, for no one here appreciated her playing as he would. He would not let her out of his room, at least not while he was still alive. For the first time, his repugnant appearance would be of some use to him. He would appear at all the doors of his room at once and hiss defiance at intruders. But his sister would not be forced to stay with him. She would do so voluntarily. She would sit beside him on the sofa, bend down to listen to him, and he would then confide in her that he had firmly resolved to send her to the conservatoire, and that if this misfortune had not prevented him, he would have told everyone about it last Christmas. Surely Christmas was past by now, and would have ignored any objections. After this explanation, his sister would be moved to tears, and Gregor would lift himself up to her shoulder and kiss her throat, which she had left exposed without a ribbon or collar, since she had been going out to work. "Here, Samsa!" cried the middle lodger, and without another word, pointed to Gregor, who was advancing slowly. The violin fell silent. The middle lodger smiled briefly, shaking his head, and then looked at Gregor again. Although the lodgers were not at all put out. In fact, they seemed to find Gregor more entertaining than the violin. His father evidently thought it more important to reassure them than to chase Gregor away. He rushed over to them, with his arms stretched out wide, and tried to usher them back into their room, at the same time attempting to block their view of him with his own body.
No, don't worry.
Now, they really did become quite annoyed, though it was unclear whether this was because of the father's behaviour, or because they only now began to realize that they had been living with a neighbor like Gregor without knowing it.
Is it?
They demanded an explanation from him,
What is it?
raised their own arms,
How-
fiddled with their beards,
How can we live in
and only
somewhere
slowly
like this?
retreated towards their own
What
room.
is- Nay.
Meanwhile, Gregor's sister
What
had
is
emerged
it?
from the daze into which she had fallen after the sudden interruption of her playing. For a while, she had continued to hold the violin and the bow in her limp hands, gazing at the sheet music as if she was still playing. But now she suddenly pulled herself together, laid the instrument in her mother's lap. She was still sitting on her chair, fighting for breath with heaving lungs, and ran into the next room, which the lodgers, urged by his father, were now rapidly approaching. Her practiced hands could now be seen throwing blankets and pillows around and arranging them on the beds. Before the gentlemen reached their room, she had finished her work and slipped back out. Her father again seemed so unable to control his own obstinacy that he had forgot all the respect he still owed his tenants. He pushed them back, and again as far as the door, where the middle gentleman stamped his foot thunderously on the floor and brought him to a standstill. "I hereby declare," he said, raising his hand and also addressing Gregor's mother and sister, "that in view of the disgusting conditions prevailing in this apartment—" At this he paused to spit empathetically on the floor. "I am giving my notice immediately. I shall not, of course, pay a penny for the time I have lived here either. Indeed, I shall consider whether or not we shall proceed against you with certain claims, which, believe me, can be very easily substantiated." He stopped, looked straight in front of him, as if expecting something further. And indeed, his two friends immediately added, "We are also giving immediate notice." Then he seized the handle and slammed the door shut with a crash. Gregor's father groped his way unsteadily to his armchair and collapsed into it. It looked as if he was stretching out for his usual evening nap. But from the violent way his head rolled about as if unsupported, it was clear that he was anything but asleep. At this time, Gregor had lain motionless just where the lodgers had caught sight of him. Disappointment at the failure of his plan, but perhaps also his weakness after being deprived of food for so long, made it impossible for him to move. Dreading that at any moment a wholesale calamity was almost certain to descend upon his head, he waited. He was not even startled when the violin on his mother's lap slipped from her trembling fingers and fell with a reverberating sound. "Dear parents," said his sister, bringing her hand down on the table for attention, "this cannot go on. If you cannot see that, then I can. I won't utter my brother's name in front of this dreadful creature, so I'll just say this. We must try to get rid of it. We've done everything humanely possible to look after it and put up with it, and I don't think anyone can blame us in the slightest." "She's absolutely right," said Gregor's father to himself. His mother, who was still struggling for breath, held her hand in front of her mouth to stifle a coughing fit with a wild look in her eyes. His sister ran over to her and held her forehead. Her words seemed to have prompted her father to marshal his thoughts. He had taken his place at the table and sat there upright, fiddling with his official's cap among the plates which were still lying there from the lodgers' meal, and glanced from time to time at the motionless Gregor. "We must try to get rid of it," said his sister, addressing herself solely to her father, as her mother could hear nothing for the coughing. "It will be the end of both of you. I can see it coming. If we all have to work as hard as we do, we can't put up with this endless torment at home as well. I can't stand it anymore myself." And she burst out crying so violently that her tears ran down over her mother's face, which her mother wiped away with mechanical movement of her hand. "But, my child," said her father with compassion and remarkable understanding, "what are we to do?" His daughter could only shrug her shoulders as a sign of the helplessness that, in contrast to her earlier self-assurance, had overwhelmed her while she was weeping. "If only he could understand us," said her father, half questioningly. But she shook her head violently in the midst of her tears to indicate that there was no question of that. If he could understand us," her father repeated, and by closing his eyes, he accepted her conviction that such a thing was not possible. "Then we might come to some arrangement with him. But as it is—" "It's got to go!" cried Gregor's sister. "That's the only way, father! You just have to get rid of the idea that it's Gregor. Our real problem is that we've believed it for so long. But how can it be Gregor? If it was Gregor, he would have realized long ago that it's impossible for human beings to live as a creature like that, and he would have gone of his own accord. Then we wouldn't have a brother anymore, but we'd be able to carry on with our lives and honor his memory. But as it is, this creature plagues us, drives our lodgers away. It clearly wants to take over the whole apartment and make us sleep in the street. Look, Father! She gave a sudden shriek. He's off again! And in a panic that was totally incomprehensible to Gregor, his sister even abandoned her mother and quite simply fled from the chair where she'd sat, as if she would rather sacrifice her mother than be anywhere near him. She dashed behind her father's chair. Alarmed by her behaviour, he also stood up and half raised his arms in front of her as if to protect her. But Gregor had not the slightest wish to frighten anyone, least of all his sister. He had merely begun to turn around in order to get back to his room. However, his efforts attracted their attention, because in his weakened condition, he could only turn around laboriously, and had to use his head to help him by raising it several times and banging it onto the floor. He stopped and looked around. The family had apparently understood his good intentions. It had only been a momentary panic. Now they all looked at him, sadly, in silence. His mother was lying in her chair, her legs stretched out and pressed tightly together, her eyelids drooping wearily. His sister was still sitting next to her father, with her hands around his neck. Now perhaps I'll start being able to turn around again, thought Gregor, resuming his efforts. He could not help gasping with the exertion, and had to stop and rest now and then. In any case, no one was harassing him. It was all left to him. Once he had turned himself around, he immediately started to crawl straight back. He was amazed at the distance between him and his room, and could not understand how only in a short time before he had covered the same distance in his weakened state almost without noticing. All the time he was so intent on making rapid progress that he scarcely noticed that no word or cry from his family had distracted him. Only when he had reached the door did he turn his head around. Not completely, for he felt his neck stiffening. But he could still see that behind him nothing had changed, except that his sister had stood up. His last glance took in his mother, who was now fast asleep. He was scarcely inside his room when the door was quickly shut, locked, and bolted. Gregor was so alarmed at the sudden noise behind him that his tiny legs gave away. It was his sister who had been in such a hurry. She had been standing there, ready and waiting, and she leapt across the room so lightly that Gregor had not heard her coming. At last! She called to her parents as she turned to the key in the lock. What now? Gregor wondered, looking around in the dark. He soon discovered that he could no longer move at all. He was not surprised by this. Instead, it struck him as not normal that he had actually been able to move around at all on such thin little legs. Otherwise, he felt relatively comfortable. Although his whole body hurt, it seemed to him that the pain was gradually getting less severe and would finally go away entirely. Now he could hardly feel the rotten apple in his back and the inflammation around the wound, which was completely covered with a layer of soft dust. He recalled his family with tenderness and love. His conviction that he had to go was, if anything, even firmer than his sister's. He remained in this state of vacant and peaceful reflection until the clock in the bell tower struck 3 a.m. He still survived to see the light breaking everywhere outside the window. Then his head drooped involuntarily on the floor, and from his nostrils flowed his last weak breath. When the cleaner came early that morning, with her energy and bustle, however many times she had been asked not to, she slammed every door shut so loudly that it was impossible to sleep peacefully anywhere in the apartment after her arrival. At first, she found nothing out of the ordinary on her usual brief visit to Gregor's room. She thought he was deliberately lying there, motionless, and pretending to be offended. She gave him credit for understanding virtually everything. She happened to be holding her long broom, so she tried to tickle Gregor with it from the doorway. When even that had no effect, she got annoyed and poked him gently. It was only when she pushed him a little way without any resistance on his part that she looked more closely. When the truth dawned on her, she opened her eyes wide and whistled to herself. But she did not wait around. She flung open the bedroom door and shouted into the darkness. Come have a look! It's croaked! It's lying there, dead as a doornail! The Samsas sat bolt right in the marriage
What are
bed.
you telling us?
It took a while before they got over the fright the cleaner had
Why are
given
you
them,
yelling?
and
It's
grasped what she was telling them.
What are you telling us?
But then they hurriedly
Quiet.
got out of bed,
No.
one each side.
No.
Herr Samsa threw the blanket over his shoulders. His wife got up, only wearing her nightdress. And in this state, they went into Gregor's room. Meanwhile, the door of the living room was opened too. Greta had been sleeping there since the lodgers had moved in. She was fully dressed, as if she had not slept at all, and her pallor seemed to confirm. "Dead?" asked Frau Samsa, looking inquiringly up at the cleaner, though she was quite capable of going to see for herself, and could even see without looking closely. "I should say so," said the cleaner, and to prove it, she shoved Gregor's corpse a good distance sideways with her broom. Frau Samsa made a gesture as if to hold back the broom, but refrained. "Well," said Herr Samsa, "now we can give thanks to God." He crossed himself, and the three women followed his example. Greta, who had not taken her eyes off the corpse, said, "Look how thin he was. He hasn't eaten anything for so long. His food came out just as it was put in." And indeed, Gregor's body was quite flat and dried out, as they only realized now that his little legs no longer supported him, and there was nothing else to distract their attention. "Come in with us for a while, Greta," said Frau Samsa with a mournful smile. And Greta, after a backward glance at the corpse, followed her parents into the bedroom. The cleaner shut the door and threw the windows wide open. Although it was still early in the morning, there was already a hint of mildness in the cool air. For now, it was late March. The three lodgers emerged from their room and looked around in astonishment for their breakfast. They had been forgotten. "Where is our breakfast?" the middle one asked the cleaner crossly. But she put her finger to her lips, and without a word, beckoned them to come quickly into Gregor's room, which they did, and stood, their hands in their pockets, or rather their shabby jackets, around Gregor's corpse in the room, which was now in full daylight. Then the bedroom door opened, and Herr Samsa appeared in his uniform, with his wife on one arm and his daughter on the other. They were all rather tearful. Now and then Greta buried her face on her father's sleeve. "Leave my house at once," said Herr Samsa, and pointed to the door without leaving hold of the women. "What do you mean?" said the middle lodger in some dismay. He smiled ingratiatingly. The other two held their hands behind their backs, rubbing them together all the while, as if in anticipation of a great quarrel that could only end in their favour. "I mean exactly what I say," replied Herr Samsa, advancing on him with his two companions on either side. At first, the lodger stood there looking at the floor, as if he were putting things in new order in his mind. "Then we shall go too," he said, looking up at Herr Samsa, as if in sudden access to humility. He even needed permission for this decision too. Herr Samsa simply glared at him, and nodded curtly several times, at which the gentleman did in fact stride out into the hall. His two friends, who had all this while stopped rubbing their hands and had been listening closely, now skipped after him, as if they feared Herr Samsa might reach the hallway before them and cut them off from their leader. In the hall, the three of them took their hats from the coat rack, picked up their canes from the umbrella stand, bowed silently, and left the apartment. With a feeling of mistrust that proved to be quite groundless, Herr Samsa stepped out into the landing with the two women. Leaning over the banister, they watched as the three gentlemen, slowly but steadily, descended the long staircase, disappearing at a bend in the stairs on each floor and reappearing a few seconds later. The further down they got, the less interest the Samsa family took in them. And as a butcher's delivery boy with a tray on his head swaggered up the stairs towards them, and then climbed far above them, Herr Samsa and the women soon came away from the banister and returned, seemingly relieved to their apartment. And they decided to spend that day resting and taking a walk. Not only had they earned this respite from work, they absolutely needed it. And so they sat down at the table and wrote 3 letters of apology. Herr Samsa to his manager, Frau Samsa to her client, and Greta to her employer. While they were writing, the cleaner came in to say she was going, because she had done her work for the morning. At first, the 3 of them simply nodded without looking up. Only when the cleaner made no move to go did they look up in annoyance. "Well?" asked Herr Samsa. The cleaner stood in the doorway, smiling, as if she had some very good news to announce to the family, but would only tell them if they quizzed her about it. The little ostrich feather she wore almost upright in her hat which had irritated Herr Samsa ever since she started working in the house, swayed gently this way and that. "What is it then?" asked Frau Samsa, to whom the cleaner still showed most respect. "Well," replied the cleaner, laughing good-naturedly and unable to answer for a moment. "Well, you needn't worry about getting rid of that thing next door. It's all been done." Frau Samsa and Greta bent over their letters again, as if to go on writing. Herr Samsa, who realized that the cleaner was about to describe everything in detail, held his hand out firmly to silence her. Thus prevented from telling her story, she remembered she was in a great hurry, and clearly offended, called out, "Goodbye, old then," turned around angrily, and left the apartment, furiously banging doors behind her. "She'll be dismissed this evening," said Herr Samsa, but neither his wife nor daughter answered. The cleaner seemed to have shattered their barely restored peace of mind. They rose and went to the window, where they stayed hugging each other closely. Herr Samsa turned in his armchair and watched them in silence for a while. "Come over here, then. It's time to let those old things be, and have some consideration for me, too." The women immediately obeyed. They hurried over to him, caressed him, and quickly finished off their letters. Then all three left the apartment together, something they had not done for months, and took the tram to the country outside the town. The carriage, which they had to themselves, was flooded with warm sunshine. Sitting back comfortably in their seats, they discussed their future prospects, which turned out, on closer inspection, to be not so bad at all. For the jobs all three of them had, never had actually asked each other about them before, were good ones, and especially promising with regard to the future. For the moment, the greatest improvement in their situation, of course, had to be a change of apartment. They would take one that was smaller and cheaper, but better suited and altogether more convenient than the present one, which Gregor had found for them. While they were talking about these things, it occurred to the Samsas almost simultaneously, watching their increasingly lively daughter, that in spite of all the worry that had given her such pale cheeks, she had recently blossomed into a good-looking and full-bodied girl. Falling into silence, and almost unconsciously understanding each other's glances, they thought how it would soon be time to find a good husband for her. And it was as if to confirm their newfound dreams and their good intentions that when they reached their destination, their daughter got up before they did and stretched her young body. Thank you so very much for listening. If you enjoyed, please like, comment, share, all that jazz, and if you really enjoyed, do subscribe, because there is more to come. Not of this, but another short story very, very soon. Next week, in fact. Next Friday. If you're listening on podcast, please leave a review, as it's the easiest way to get this in front of as many people as possible, and reading your reviews really makes my day. If you want to support the show further, you can give me a donation by means of a super thanks here on YouTube, because these things take ages and I have bills to pay, or you can do it on Ko-Fi as well, where you'll find the link to that in the description box. If not, just keep listening, and yeah, I'll see you soon. Once again, thank you for listening, and until next time, bye-bye.